Welcome to Pera's Playbook. This is your host, Alex Pera. Let's open up our playbook and see who our guest is. Please enjoy. Welcome to episode 158 of Pera's Playbook. Today we're joined by Richard Strange. He's an actor and a musician, and he's 4 hours ahead of me right now. I think it's 1 o'clock for him over in England, and it's 9 in the morning here. But we're gonna record a great podcast here, talking about music and acting and all kinds of other stuff. So happy to have Richard here. How's it going?
Really looking forward to this. I'm sorry about the misunderstanding last time, but we'll make up for it today.
Yes, we will indeed. The time changes are tough. It's really easy to screw it up 5 hours ahead. Sometimes I'm interviewing people from California. They're 3 or 4 hours behind. So it's one way or the other. Easy to mess
You
it
know
up.
what? California is really hard for me because that's 8 hours from here. And the Far East, like Hong Kong, Japan, is really hard. That's 8 hours ahead of me.
Yeah,
And it means you're always in a different headspace. You know, either
yeah.
you've just got up and the person you're talking to is just about to go to bed, or it's the other way around. You know, this is good. 5 hours, we can do that.
Yes, for sure. I'm going to attempt with somebody who's in Australia in a couple of weeks, and I think
Oh my
they're
gosh.
10 or 11 hours ahead of me. So it's going to be
Wow.
nighttime for me and morning for them. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, good luck with that. Yeah.
Thanks. So let's start with kind of going back in time and starting with your music career. When did you become interested in music? Like when you were a kid?
Well, okay, let me tell you, I'm 74 years old, so I was lucky. I grew up post-war, but I had two older brothers. My eldest brother, John, was about 6 or 7 years older than me. No, a bit more actually, about 8 years older. And so he got into rock and roll as soon as rock and roll hit England. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, all that stuff. So that was coming into my house thanks to him. And then my middle brother, Brian, around the early 60s, 1964, which is when obviously the Beatles and the Stones and the Animals and the Who and all that stuff was taking off, and the Yardbirds, they're the bands I love. But my brother changed my life when he came home with a record by this guy called Bob Dylan, right? And I'd never heard of him. I was 14 years old. But I just loved it, man. I love the words. And the words have always been what's got me into music. It's always been the entree for me. It's been the key. And when I heard Bob Dylan, I guess it was Times Hour Changing or Freewheeling, one of those. When I heard that for the first time, it was a real game changer, you know? It was like no one's ever written songs like this, as far as I know. And it's poetry, and I loved it. I just got off on it so much. And then I was really lucky because I took this record to school. In those days, of course, a record was a record. It was a 12-inch bit of plastic and a lovely piece of artwork. Usually it had liner notes on the back. And this particular Bob Dylan record that I borrowed from my brother, I'm not sure I ever gave it back to him, actually. It had sort of blank verse poetry on the back. And I had one of these great teachers who had a look at it, and rather than patronizing me or disrespecting, he said, "This looks interesting. What's this guy?" I said, "He's an American protest singer, folk singer called Bob Dylan." And this teacher read the stuff on the back, and he said, "You know what, if you like it," and it was poetry. He said, "If you like this, you might like this stuff." And he introduced me to the beat writers, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. I was up and gone, man. I was flying.
Yeah, Bob Dylan is fantastic. I quite enjoy Bob Dylan. Like you said, the lyrics, the songwriting it's so incredible. I really like the song Hurricane. It's like an 8 minute
Yeah,
long song, but it tells a
love that song.
amazing story.
Yeah,
And sometimes it's hard when you have a long song. Sometimes you can lose interest, but not
yeah.
that song.
Oh,
Have you
that
seen
song's
the?
great because it tells it's like the old style English ballads, if you like, and American ballads where they're telling the story. And this is obviously a time before television, a time before radio, when troubadours, singers used to go round from village to village and they'd sing songs and people would listen like we listen to uh, music now, or like we watch television in the 70s and 80s. It was like these balladeers, these troubadours, were almost bringing us a news broadcast about what was happening somewhere else in the world.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, uh, people like like nowadays, I feel like young people, they can't appreciate that necessarily because you just turn on the TV and you watch whatever you want,
Yeah,
and music is it's so much more accessible in a different way now with Spotify and YouTube and iTunes and all this
absolutely.
stuff. It's totally different. You were talking about having a record, or if you had eventually cassettes and CDs. Now you just
Yeah,
pull out your phone and you've got endless supply of music.
yep, absolutely right. Yep, that's how it was.
So you had a band in the 70s, Doctors of Madness, kind of in the
Yeah,
British punk rock scene. And I took a class in college, the history of rock, and we went through every era of rock, going all the way back to the 30s and forward. And we touched on punk rock and the Sex Pistols and the
yep,
Clash and all
yep.
that stuff. So let's talk a little bit about your band and that kind of era of music.
So I mentioned Bob Dylan, but I tell you what else had happened who had a big effect on me. The Velvet Underground had happened, Lou Reed, 1966, 67. And then following on from Lou, you'd had people like Jim Morrison, The Doors, which I loved. And again, it's the words that got me. And then an English singer called David Bowie. And Bowie was a big influence on me because Bowie was one of these people who would listen to other artists, not just rock artists. He'd listen to French singers, he'd listen to folk singers, he'd listen to musical theatre singers, and he'd steal a little bit here and there. Uh, and Bowie had, in 1973, 74, he came up with this character, Ziggy Stardust, right? Who was a very theatrical sort of flamboyant character. And he did a show based around this imaginary rock star, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And for me, that was a great piece of rock theater. And I thought, if I make a band, I want it to be visual. I want it to be challenging. I want it to be referencing stuff outside of music. So referencing literature, painting, theater, dance, poetry, all this sort of stuff. And so when Bowie happened in the 1973, 74, 75, and another English band called Roxy Music happened around the same time, I thought that's the sort of thing I'd like to do. I'd like to do music that was visually arresting, visually interesting. So to do a good rock show, but also to talk about stuff, reference stuff that was outside of music. So I always have been interested in politics. I've always been interested in contemporary art. I've always been interested in books and theatre and painting and stuff. So I always had a lot of stuff I wanted to talk about I wanted to sing about. So I formed a band, Doctors of Madness, in 1974. Um, and I had in my head what the sound would be like. It would be abrasive, it would be rough, it would not be virtuoso, beautiful music. It would be music that got a reaction from the kids. And I started doing this. I slowly put a band together. We were a four-piece band. And exactly the same as today, bands had a problem. How do you get people to come and see you when no one knows you? And how do you get people to know you when no one can come and see you because you're not doing shows, right? So I've always been a can-do sort of guy. I'm not the sort of person who thinks the world owes me a living. So I'm going to make my own luck. So I found a bar in London where they had a nice music room, but they didn't have any music. The guy said to me, "We tried music, it didn't work." I said, "Look, give me 4 consecutive Saturdays here, and let me see if I can make it work." I didn't have a clue if I could, but I knew that that place was empty, and he wasn't selling his beer if there was no one there, right? So we said, "Okay, we give it a go." Now, just to contextualize this, this is a time before digital media. There is no social media. There's no mobile telephones. There's no smartphones. There's no internet. So all my marketing, all my publicity, all my promotion had to be done old style, analog. Posters, flyers, word of mouth, even the old telephone call. "Hi, what are you doing Saturday? I've got a gig," right? Something like that. Anyway, the first night of these 4 Saturdays, about 15 people came along. The guy with the bar was happy because that was 15 more than he had the week before. And I thought that's a start. The next week we had 30. The next week we had 60. The next week, our final fourth week, we had about 150 in. And the place went wild. The place went ape. Uh, and I thought, well, that's great, except next week we don't have a gig. We're back to square one. And I was really lucky. Just as we're packing up the equipment and about to get the bus home because we didn't have a car even, guy comes and knocks on the door of the dressing room. He introduced himself as Brian Morrison. He says, "I used to manage a band called Pink Floyd. I used to manage a band called T-Rex. I used to manage a band called the Bee Gees. I made so much money, I retired. I got bored. And now I'm bored again. A friend of mine came and saw you last week and said you're great." And he said, "You're not great, but you could be." uh, he said, "If you're serious about turning professional," because at that time we were just a semi-pro amateur band playing for drinks. He said, "Come and see me in my office on Monday." So we went in and saw him. Sure enough, all over the walls there are gold discs. There's gold discs of Pink Floyd and Bee Gees and all this sort of stuff. And he gets the contracts out and he says, "Sign here, sign here, sign here, sign here." 50 years later, I'm still paying for some of those signatures I put on. But the next day, I was a professional musician. He said, "I'm going to put you into a rehearsal studio for 6 weeks. I want you to write songs. I want you to work out who you are on stage, what you're going to do with lights, with costume, with movement, with attitude, all that stuff. And at the end of 6 weeks, I'm going to bring the biggest names in the music business in to see you, and I'll get you a record deal." And that's what he did. 6 weeks later, he brought in Clive Davis from CBS, from America, to see us. He brought in Ahmet Ertegun from Atlantic Records to see us. And anyway, in the end, we ended up signing with a record company called Phonogram in Europe. We did I think a 4 album deal. It's 1975. And we started touring. And we started touring smallish places. Then we got a support spot with a bigger band than us called Bebop Deluxe, who were up and coming, but they had a bigger following than us. We went out on the road with them, played some big places. And then we did our own tour, and our first tour of our own. We were playing to 600, 800 people a night. Because back then, the, the big things were the music press and music radio. If you got good press, you got good radio play, you'd get a good audience to come and see you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that story. I love hearing stories of how people got going, and especially in a totally different era. Nowadays, a lot of musicians, they post their stuff online, videos, people watch it and they start getting clicks, and then people share it around. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's different and it's a little bit
It's
easier.
different. It's another world. This digital world is another world. And I'm not someone who says it was better or it was worse when I was growing up. I think it's really tough for kids today. It was tough for us back then too, because uh, you couldn't make your own records back then. You had to go into a studio. It was not a case of you've got Logic or you've got GarageBand or you've got Pro Tools on your laptop and you can make a record that's as good as anything that's made at Abbey Road or the record plant, which you can do now. But back then, forget it. You had to get either you saved your money yourself or you got a record company interested or a manager to put you into a studio to record a song, two songs, three songs, and they'd want it done quickly because the studios were expensive. Um,
Yeah.
so back then, if you had a bit of record company interest, you were ahead of the game. Now you can make beautiful records in your bedroom, but so can every other Joe. And the problem now is how do you get your music heard above everyone else's when there's so much great music out there? It's
Yeah.
difficult, you know.
Right.
The key for me is live work. Live. I love playing live. I'm good live, and I connect. I connect well with an audience. I'm a good communicator. Some people are really anxious about going on stage. They get stage fright and all the rest, and they're not natural performers. That makes it difficult. You can be one of these artists who just records at home and just releases on Bandcamp or puts it out on TikTok or on the SoundCloud or whatever. Yeah, you can sort of do that, but the financing of it now is such that I had a song up on online a couple of weeks ago that was um, from a play that I'd been, and I'll talk about that later if you like. But this, I said, if you'd like to buy this song, give me £2 or whatever you want. £2, like $3. And $3 represents the same as having 1,500 streams on Spotify. This is one person buys my track for $3. I earn as much money as 1,500 streams. So extrapolate from that to earn $200, $300, I've got to have 100 times 1,500. So that's, 150,000 streams to get $300. And it's tough.
Yeah.
You know, even, the big ones, you get 1 million streams, you maybe earn $2,000 from Spotify. That's not a week's work, is it?
No. Yeah. So there's different challenges, right? It might be easier to get your music out there, but it's harder to make money. It's harder to compete because, like you said, everybody can do it. So there's
Everybody can
different
do it, and it's
challenges.
hard. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to try and make people notice you. Now, I did that in 1975. I decided I was going to have blue hair. Guys, don't try it. Uh, I changed my name to Kid Strange. I was Richard Strange. I became Kid Strange. Doctors of Madness, my band. We were flamboyant. We were theatrical. My violin player, electric violin player, was called Urban Blitz. The drummer was Peter Dilemma. I was Kid Strange. Uh, we looked weird. We were looked and did weird interviews. We weren't a pop band. We Punk rock hadn't happened. I've got to just contextualize this for you all. Punk rock hadn't happened. There were no Ramones. There were no Talking Heads. There were no Patti Smith or Richard Hell and the Voidoids in 1975. That hadn't happened. You'd had David Bowie. You'd had the Velvet Underground. You had Iggy Pop. That's about as wild as it got. So when we started, it was not like there was an audience just waiting for us. You had to convince those people that that's what they were waiting for. This guy with blue hair. And not every school kid was convinced he was waiting for a guy with blue hair.
Yeah. Yeah. So you guys came in before the punk rock scene started.
Came in before the punk rock. Now, you don't get any medals for being first in this business, unfortunately. You get a bit of pride for it. And I get a bit of pride from the fact that the Clash used to come and see us. The Sex Pistols supported us. The Joy Division supported us. The Simple Minds supported us. They were our opening bands because we were the only band like that they liked. They were just starting up. The Adverts, The Damned, The Clash, Susie and the Banshees, Joy Division, The Skids, all these bands, they loved us. The Jam supported us 4 times because there was no one around like us who would have a band like them on the bill with them.
Yeah.
You know, it was a weird old time because music was just coming out of the late 60s hippie thing, and then it got into prog rock, all this really complex virtuoso playing like Yes and Genesis and Jethro Tull and all these bands who were muso bands. They were great players. It never interested me, that music. That's not what I got into music for.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's I love talking about music history, looking at how music evolved over time and
Yeah,
how, people took it and they put their own spin on it and what set you out, and like what did you do to make it different and
yeah,
then, like you said, all those bands you named became wildly popular. It was something that people liked. They liked that rebellious nature, and
yeah,
then right, grunge rock happens later on, and heavy
yeah.
metal and all this stuff that spawns off decades later, and it's still spawning off today.
Sure. One thing that's interesting that we maybe want to touch upon now is the way that the development of technology has a big effect on the development of music. And let me explain this. When the main way of buying music when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s was a 7-inch vinyl single, right?
Yeah.
It had two sides. You could put it on a jukebox, you could put it on your record player at home. 7-inch single. Now, the nature of that particular technology, the material and the process of pressing it and having a groove, meant that you could get about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes of music on one side before the quality of the sound started to disintegrate. And that, to this day, is why a pop song is 3 minutes long. Now, in a digital world, there's a pop song could be 3 hours long, could be 3 days long, with no loss of audio quality. But it's still a pop song is 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Now, when in the late 60s, pop music became rock music, and people concentrated more on albums rather than on singles, and it became a bit more serious. You had bands like The Doors or Frank Zappa or the Beatles or the Stones doing more elaborate music, mid 60s going into the late 60s. And then it became what we call progressive rock, prog rock, we call it. Um, it meant that if you made an album, yes, you could get 6 3-minute songs on each side, or, and this is where music changed, you could get 20 minutes on each side without a break. So you could imitate symphonic form, classical music form. And this is what those rock bands did in the late 60s. They weren't doing 3-minute songs anymore, they were doing 12-minute songs with a 5-minute drum solo in the middle and an 8-minute bass solo. Yeah.
Yeah.
And not only that, not only doing two sides of that, they were doing double albums and triple albums, man. Right?
Yeah.
So it was like imitating Beethoven or Bach or Tchaikovsky. It's like here's a piece of music that's 45 minutes long. Pink Floyd, people like that.
Yeah.
Then, because music is generational, your younger brother has been listening to the music that you're listening to, and he thinks it's rubbish. He thinks it's real garbage, man. He wants music of his own. Give me a 3 minute song with two chords. Give me punk rock. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how it happens. Then it flips. And punk rock was never about albums, it was always about singles. The Sex Pistols, Anarchy in the UK, The Clash, White Riot, Richard Hell, Black Generation, you know, um, the Talking Heads, Psycho Killer Qu'est-ce que c'est, the Ramones, Gabba Gabba Hey. It was never, it was never about albums. It became about albums later because the record companies thought this is the way we can make the most money is by selling albums, not by selling singles for $1.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting when you look at it. The way not only the sound of like, but the, like you said, the albums, what people put out, how many songs they were putting out, and obviously nowadays, like you said, you can release any length song you want. It still sounds wonderful.
Yeah,
You can get it on Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, TikTok,
exactly.
wherever, and but also like not that it's as big, but vinyl's coming back. People are back into vinyl. This stuff
Yeah,
cycles back through all over again.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Now, the funny thing is that this doesn't only apply to music, this applies to film as well. If we now watch film on our phones, the sort of film that is going to be made is not the same film that will be shown in an IMAX cinema
Yeah.
because it's a different experience. So people are making films differently now. And when I'm teaching music students, I sometimes uh, have a lecture about how uh, technology dictates not just the form of the record, but the content of the record. And by that I mean, can you imagine hip hop ever happening if drum machines and samplers had not been invented? Would
Right.
never have happened. The technology drove the music, it drove the content. Auto Tune, you remember that horrible song by Cher, Believe, where all that song was about the auto tune pitch correction on her voice. That's all that was about, that song. It wasn't about the melody or the lyric or anything. It was about that sound that everyone thought, that's cool, that sound. How do they do that? That's technology dictating content in music as well as the form that it takes. Okay, you buy it as an MP3, you download it as an MP3, or we used to do file sharing, or you used to buy vinyl, or you used to buy cassettes or whatever. The method of distribution changes, and that method of distribution, the technology dictates the sort of music you're listening to as well. TikTok now. TikTok wants a 20-second song. So TikTok gets the 20-second song.
Yeah. Yeah. It is really amazing the way it changed. When you were talking about the technology, I started thinking about in the 80s and the synthesizers, like the synth pop, and then you
Yeah,
even had rock bands like Van Halen that started using that in their music, which usually,
absolutely.
so they played with the times and they ran with it, and yeah, the getting into hip hop and yeah, it's just whatever the technology is kind of dictates partly
Absolutely.
what you're
No,
gonna get.
nothing's original, and that doesn't mean nothing's interesting. What's interesting is what people do with two existing forms. When you bang two stones together, like Van Halen or like the old band ZZ Top or something, using electronics and heavy rock to get a new sound.
Yeah.
You remember that song with um, what were they called? Walk This Way. It was
Oh yeah, Run DMC and Aerosmith.
Run DMC and the rock band. What were they
Yeah,
called? Some
Aerosmith.
kind of band.
Yeah.
Aerosmith, was it? Or
Yeah, yep,
yeah,
yeah.
there you go. So there again, that's a sort of a coming together of two very different musics. To yeah, even looking at much more recently, Beyonce doing a country album.
Yep. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's not a country album, but it is a country album. You know,
Yeah. Right. There's other artists doing that now. Post
yeah,
Malone is doing collaborations with Morgan
absolutely,
Wallen, and I mean it's whatever they think is gonna make more money or get more hits or views or
absolutely.
playing into different genres and the new
Oh man,
country.
I'm so lonesome I could cry.
Yeah, and some genres have blend like a lot of the new country music sounds more like pop music now than classic country did. And so I mean it's all changing. That's a new in 50 years when people look back at the country music of today, and then if you go back 100 years to the country music from 1950, I mean it's just completely different, not even close to the same.
Absolutely, absolutely, completely different.
Yeah. Well, why don't we segue into film and acting? Because you were also an actor. You've had roles in Batman, 1989, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Gangs of New York, Inkheart, Harry Potter, Deathly Hallows Part 1, among
Yeah,
other projects. So, how did you go from music to acting?
because I'm the luckiest man in the world. I'll tell you what happened. 1976, Doctors of Madness were going along great. 1977, we're doing great. 1977, I got a call from my agent saying, look, I need you to help me out. I'm being harassed every day by a manager of a band, and he wants a gig outside of London for this band. No one will touch this band because they've got a bad reputation. Will you take them outside of London and just let them open the show for you? This was the Sex Pistols. I I said sure, because I'd been where they were. I'd been in that position where no one will give you a gig. And they were young kids. They were 3 years younger than me, 4 years younger than me. I was playing to 600, 800, or 1,000 people a night, and they wanted to get a start. I thought that's great. I watched them from the side of the stage, and I knew that my music career was finished because something had just come along that was newer, fresher, younger than me, and I was finished. I was history. I was 24 years old, man. I was history, right?
Yeah.
So this is something I talk to students about a lot. Self-reflection. When things go well or things go badly, give yourself a bit of time and think, why did that go well? What went really well? What did I do well? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Who am I best if I collaborate with? Who can do some stuff better than me? Maybe he's a bass player or keyboard player who plays better than me, a producer who produces better than me. Maybe I'm good at singing and writing songs. Maybe I'm not Eric Clapton or Eddie Van Halen, on the old guitar. So a little bit of self-reflection. At the end of that year, when punk rock became the only show in town in the music business, and although all those punk bands were fans of mine, I'd been around 2 years, 3 years too long to pretend that I was a punk band, if you get me. So I had to think, well, what do I want to do for the rest of my life? I was only 25 years old. Um, and I think, well, I'm going to write a piece of music that I can perform solo, so I don't have to work with musicians. Something that embraces technology. I'm going to have pre-recorded tapes on a tape recorder. And I'm going to try to play in venues that are not music venues. So I played in art galleries, I played in hospitals, psychiatric wards, I played in prisons, I played in schools, universities, and stuff. Excuse me. Um, and I wrote a piece of music that was it was like a rock opera. In 1980, I imagined myself as president of Europe. But I imagined being president of Europe, and I thought, well, who could become president of Europe when we've got so many different languages, different religions, different cultures? I thought he'd either be a sports person or he'd be an entertainer. And so this was my idea. And I wrote an album called The Phenomenal Rise of Richard Strange, in which I become president. Okay? It's a solo show. And I toured America and Canada with this, with just a couple of tape recorders and a guitar. And I went from New York to California and back, playing a different show every night, everywhere from New York and Chicago and LA to college towns like Lawrence, Kansas, or Milwaukee, or St. Louis, or Oklahoma, or Kansas, or whatever, you know. And when I got back to London, I thought I'm going to open my own club where this crossover work is the norm. People who are doing multimedia, film, TV, video was just coming in. MTV had just started, 1980, 81. And people were getting a little bit adventurous again after the punk thing, which was very nihilistic, very negative, very, or in this country at least, it was slightly different in America. In America, your punk rockers were college kids. David Byrne, Patti Smith, Richard Hell, Lou Reed. They were all college kids. They were all bright kids who pretended to be dumb. Whereas here, as with just dumb kids who didn't have to pretend to be dumb, they were dumb. So I got back here, and I thought I'm going to open a sort of arts club, multimedia arts club, and I called it Cabaret Futura. And it was just at the beginning of that synth stuff that you were talking about earlier. So the bands I got to play were people like Depeche Mode, who were, I don't know, they were 17 years old. They did their first gig for me. I paid them $15, you know. Soft Cell, Mark Armand, same thing. The Pogues, Shane MacGowan, you know, the Irish band, same thing. They did their first gig for me. And then, so while I'm doing all this and I'm putting on little bits of theatre and poetry and something, a friend of mine came and said, look, do you want to be an actor? I said, no, I don't want to be an actor. She said, look, I'm working with a director called Frank Rodham through the summer. We're going to France. It's going to be beautiful. We're going down to the south of France in Provence. Great food, great weather, great wine. And he's doing a film with Sting and Jennifer Beals called The Bride. I said, listen, I'm really not interested. She said, well, just come and meet him. So I went and met him, and he was a lovely guy. I didn't get a part, but he said, who's your agent? I said, look, I'm not an actor. I'm a friend of your friend. And she said, come and meet you. But he said, take my advice. You've got a look, and you've got a voice, and you've got a way about you. You will always work in movies. Go and see this lady. And he introduced me to an agent. I went and saw her, and she said, well, where did you train? I said, I didn't train. I'm a total fraud. You know, I was a rock and roller, but I'm a failed rock and roller because punk rock came along and my career hit the buffers. So she said, look, I'll take you on for 6 weeks and see if you get anything. I was lucky. I told you I'm the luckiest man in the world. I got the first job I went for. It was a small film. It was a British film, small thing. But then the next film that came along was a film called Mona Lisa with Bob Hoskins and Michael Caine. I got that. The next film that came along, she said, you won't be interested in this because it's not arty. There's a young director called Tim Burton is coming to Britain to do a film of Batman with Jack Nicholson and what's his name?
Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton, exactly. I said, that sounds fun. She said, you're serious? You'd do a Batman film? I said, yeah. Anyway, at that time, Nicholson was the biggest actor in the world. And everyone loved Nicholson, and he was the Joker. And I was cast as one of his henchmen, one of his goons. And for 16 weeks, we'd go into art galleries and smash the place up and have fights and blow up cars and stuff, and get paid for it. I couldn't believe it. I got to know Jack, and Jack was lovely to work with. Tim Burton was great to work with. Then I think the next film I did was Robin Hood, next big film, Prince of Thieves, Kevin Costner. I'm the executioner, cutting Christian Slater's head off. Everyone wants to cut Christian Slater's head off, especially if you've worked with him. So I did that, and then what else I did? Martin Scorsese, Gangs of New York. We did that in Italy, in Rome. Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Day-Lewis, what's the name? Cameron Diaz. Fantastic. You get paid to do these things. You get to see the world. And then I did some theatre. I was doing a world tour of Hamlet with a Russian director. We went literally all over the world. We went to China, Japan, Australia, all over Europe to do this play. And I loved it. And then I started writing a book and a memoir and just stories about these things, the great people. And just sort of moved on from there. And I'm the sort of guy who always says yes. If someone says, look, you won't be interested in this, but let me just run it past you. What do you think about going and doing a show 200 miles inside the Arctic Circle with a flamenco dancer and an elephant? I'll say yes. I'll say yes. I've never done that before. That's new for me. If I'd been one of these guys who'd had one hit in the 70s and I could just eke out a living from doing that hit, like a lot of rock and rollers do, even now, they had one hit back in the 60s, in the 70s, or in the 80s, and there's just enough love for that artist to play to 100 people, 200 people a night, to sell a couple of T-shirts, and to pay your rent for another day. You could do that. I was lucky I didn't have that hit with Doctors and Bandits, so I had to live off my wits. And I am now fearless. I will do anything. Someone said to me a couple of years ago, in the 1970s, Frank Zappa from Mothers Who Nation wrote an opera called 200 Motels. And it was going to be played in London's biggest concert hall, the Royal Festival Hall, about 4 years ago. And I got a call from the producer saying, would you be the narrator on it? The guy who introduces it and does all the stuff between the scenes, telling people what's going on. So I said, sure. 2 days before the show, I got a call saying, can you sing a low B note? So I got my guitar tuner out. I think, yeah, sort of. It's anyway, I'm the narrator. It's only going to be a gimmick that will last for 2 seconds. I said, yeah, I can sing a low B. The next day, the day before the show, they sent me the music to sing the baritone part in this opera, right? And now, I don't say this with any pride, but I don't read music. So it was like being sent a copy of Hamlet in Chinese. I could see that it was a play, but it didn't mean anything to me. I could see that it was music. Anyway, I went to the first rehearsal, which was in the morning of the day before the show, and we had a rehearsal. We had brilliant singers, and the woman directing the rehearsal said, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have very long, as you know, so we're just going to run through this and see how it goes. So starts off with me doing the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, 200 Motels, life on the road with the mother's invention, whatever it is. Then the piano starts up, and then someone starts singing, and I can see my first singing entry coming towards me like a train crash, right? Because I don't know what I'm going to sing. So I get to my part. I get to my part. I sing it, and she says, "Have you got the right music?" I said, "I don't know. I can't read music." What are you going to do? I said, "I'm going to listen to it through rehearsal today, and I'm going to learn it by ear." She's like, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, fine." So we go on. We get to lunch. After lunch, we go into the big rehearsal room with the 80-piece BBC concert orchestra, a 40-piece choir, an 8-piece rock band, a 4-piece jazz band, and the maestro conductor who's just flown in from Germany or somewhere. And again, he's like, "Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have long. Can we go from the top, please?" And same thing. I get to my part. I haven't got a clue what I'm singing. He stops, only this time I've got 180 pairs of eyes on me, right? And he's saying, "Have you got the right music?" I said, "I'm going to learn it tonight." He said, "You're going to learn it tonight? Well, the show is tomorrow and it's going out on TV." I said, "It's going to be fine." So that's what we did. He said, "Look, I could get one of the choir to sing it and you just mime." I said, "No, it's not the way I work." So we did it the next day, standing ovation. Yes.
That's awesome. That's an awesome story. And it's just like an example of when one door closes, another one opens, right? You talked
There
about
you
punk rock
go.
kicked you out, but it kicked you into acting. And you've done, like you mentioned, plays and films, and you worked with so many phenomenal directors and actors and actresses, and you've done a wide variety of genres, and you've just got to experience all this other stuff that, like you said, it wouldn't have happened if you had those huge hits that you were just living off of. You would have never
Well,
experienced any of this.
that's right. And what happens is with each challenge that you face, with each risk that you take, and it doesn't kill you, you become bolder, you get more courage, you get more self-esteem, you get more confidence, and you've got things you can refer back to. And like, yeah, I did that opera and I didn't die. You know, it's very rare that people die on stage. I mean, metaphorically, I've died a million times on stage, but in 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 actuality, what is the worst thing that can happen going on stage or making a record? You get a flop or you get a bad review, but it doesn't kill you that. If you're smart, you learn from it. And you think either, right, I learned my lesson from that. I'm no good at that. Or I need to get better at that because I really enjoyed it, but I'm not going to get anywhere with it unless I find out the mechanics of it, the technique, the process, the practice of it.
Yeah, right. No, very true. It's like the old saying, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." I mean,
Ah,
it's
exactly.
exactly.
That that's it. This is what I say to my students. I say, be bold, take risks. You'll never make any worthwhile work if you're scared to fail. Because if you're scared to fail, all you're going to do is stick within the safe parameters of stuff that's already been done before. The great artists, whether it's Shakespeare or Picasso or David Bowie or I don't care who, they all took that chance of being laughed at, of being getting a bad critical notice. You think of Picasso's paintings. They laughed at it. It's like it doesn't look like anyone. Duh, that's the point, mate. You know, uh, you know, when Wagner was making music with the biggest orchestras anyone had ever seen, it was like, what is he doing? You don't need that. You can have a nice little chamber orchestra. Of course you can, but that doesn't move music on. Picasso doing a nice landscape or a bowl of fruit doesn't move painting on. Quentin Tarantino doing a rom-com wouldn't have moved movies on. David Lynch, if he'd not done Twin Peaks, but he'd just done a game show, that wouldn't have moved movies on. You know,
Yeah.
these people take risks and they're prepared to be ridiculed.
Yeah. And it applies to a lot in life. Music and art and film, but it also applies to entrepreneurs and people that are creating all the technology that we've been talking about, or different ways to make things easier. And if you don't take those, so it's a concept that applies across life, whatever you're passionate about, your hobby, whatever you are. I mean, blanket, applies to a lot of stuff.
Everything comes from somewhere. Nothing is like 100% original. But what is interesting is taking these existing things and messing with them, and then seeing what new shapes you could make, like with a bit of plasticine, it's like, or a bit of clay or something. It's the new shape you can make. When Twin Peaks came out on TV, 20 years ago, whatever it was, I'd never seen anything like that. I'd never seen a director create a world that I understood so quickly, but was so unlike any world I'd ever lived in.
Yeah.
You know, a surrealistic world, if you like, a world where normality had just been tweaked a little bit. So you recognize everything in Twin Peaks, but it's not the world you live in. And that's what makes it brilliant. That's what makes David Lynch a great director. That's what makes Picasso great. That's what made Stravinsky great, or that's what made Shakespeare great. You recognize the world, but you've never seen it shown to you like that before.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you have to be different,
Yeah,
to have any sort of success. And most people don't want to hear more of the same or watch more of the same. They want something different. You get bored with the same over and over.
absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, why don't we kind of wrap up the episode with what you're currently you've got in the hopper, music. I know you've had some plays and different stuff that you're still active doing things.
Well, yeah, I mean, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've sort of turned full circle. I was in hospital back in 2018, 19. Um, and hold on. Oh, no, don't go away. Okay. Yeah, 2018, 2019, I was in hospital. And I thought, not to be too dramatic about it, I thought that my number was up. And I thought that's a shame because I still haven't made the album that I'd like to be remembered by. I'd made music since the Doctors of Madness had finished in 1978. I'd done different things. I'd done world music and I'd done collaborations with people. But I was in hospital, in my hospital bed, and I started writing songs again. And I was writing furiously because I thought the world was entering a really dark place, and I think I was right. Um, anyway, in a couple of weeks, I wrote maybe 10 songs, and I didn't know what to do with them. My health was not good. I was recovering, but I was not in a good physical health space. And I sent these songs to a friend of mine called John Leckie. And John Leckie produced my second album back in the 70s, Doctors of Madness. But then he went on to do Radiohead. He did Pink Floyd. He did Stone Roses. He did Muse. He did a load of great, great bands. And I said, John, I know you're really busy. Take your time, but have a listen to these songs and let me know if you think it's worth doing anything. He got back to me the next day and said, this is a really important album. We've got to make this record. How much money have you got? I said, about $10, um, he said, look, I'll find a studio but we're going to have to work really hard and long hours and a short period of time. I said, great. He found a studio. By then, I was working with two Japanese musicians who'd been Doctors of Madness fans, and they'd had a Doctors of Madness tribute band in Japan, and they'd become my band because they were brilliant. They knew all my songs. These were new songs. So I flew these two people over to London. We went into the studio, started laying this music down very, very quickly. And then something magical happened. I started getting phone calls from people who I didn't even know were fans of mine. Joe Elliott from Def Leppard phoned me. He'd just been inducted into the Hall of Fame, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He said, "What's this I hear about a new Doctors of Madness album?" I said, "Yeah, I'm, you know." He said, "I want to be on it. I want to be your backing singer." He said, "We used to come to every show you ever did in the north of England when we were kids. You know, we love Dogs of Manners, and I want to give something to you back. If it helps you, send me however many songs you want, and I will sing on them for you." Right? So this was a this came out a couple of years ago. So it's called Dark Times, which is obviously why. Uh, the cover was done by a lovely guy called Rich Good, who's the guitar player in the Psychedelic Furs. He's a designer. Um, so I did that. I did a memoir. I wrote a memoir about my life working as an actor, as a musician, as a club owner, and so on. And then I wrote a play called When You Awake, You Will Remember Nothing. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, when it was William Burroughs's centenary of his birth, I wanted to do an event that would celebrate him. William Burroughs, a great American writer, and again, one of those people who changed the course of literature. And I wrote an opera based on his life and work called Language as a Virus from Outer Space. And we put that on in a big concert hall here. Then I did another play that I've just finished in London last week, 2 weeks ago, called The Black Square, which imagines a world not far from now where it's illegal for us to own a photograph, to own an image, to own a movie, because we didn't check the small print when we were putting stuff up on Facebook or on TikTok or whatever. We signed away the copyright to these big companies. And this play, The Black Square, imagines this world in a couple of years' time where if you own an image of your own baby or of a holiday or your mum and dad, wedding photo, you're breaking the law because we didn't read the copyright as we put it up on YouTube or on Facebook or Instagram, whatever. So that's just finished. Tonight, I am hosting and comparing a talent evening in a club in Mayfair in London. There's six singers. One of them is my daughter, so I'm hoping she's going to win.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, of course you got to root for your daughter. That's awesome. You've been obviously keeping busy, getting into more writing. And are you still writing music too, along
I
with
am.
plays?
I am. Yeah, I've got another record coming out this year with just a piano player. And funnily enough, if you'd asked me what I'm doing next 2 weeks ago, I would have said I'm coming to America as the host and compere and sort of MC of a series of orchestral concerts of the music of Harry Potter, which is about to tour America. There's orchestral concerts of the music from Harry Potter, and they asked a few of us actors who were in Harry Potter whether we'd be interested in coming to 4, 5, 6 of those shows in America and Canada. I said yes to that. And last week I got the bad news that because of this current administration. Uh, it is very, very difficult now for orchestras or artists of any sort to get working visas to come to America. So it's been cancelled, or at least it's been kicked into the long grass for a while, and that's really sad because I think artists should be able to perform anywhere and everywhere, and that's how we get to understand each other, and the world stays at peace with itself.
Yeah, hopefully it's just postponed for a little bit, not fully canceled. Hopefully
Let's
sometime in
let's
the future we can get that going. Harry Potter's wonderful too, wonderful music, and
yeah,
I'm
great
sure
music.
they'd be
Yeah,
fantastic shows, you
yeah,
know.
yeah. No, I've been really lucky. I mean, I've worked with Danny Elfman on the Batman film. There's great Harry Potter music. Scorsese always used great music. Gangs of New York. I did Gangs of New York. I'm really lucky that I've worked with some of the greats in every sphere. Jack Nicholson, Tim Burton, Robert Wilson, Tom Waits. I've just been really, really lucky.
Yeah, and film music is phenomenal. I love film music. I love
Oh,
film
I love it.
scores,
I love
TV
it. I
show
love it.
music.
Yeah.
On my Spotify update from last year, my number one listened to artist was Ramin Djawadi, the guy that does all the Game of Thrones music. He was my number one listened to artist.
Yeah, brilliant. Love it. Love it.
Yeah,
Love it.
it's all great stuff. But yeah, so I think that's a good place to wrap up the podcast. I really appreciate you
Well,
coming on,
it's
sharing your life
been a
story and
pleasure.
everything.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you, and I hope uh, we get across there at some point and we could have a beer together.
That sounds wonderful. Thanks for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes soon.